Modern fantasy RPGs spend millions on facial animation and open worlds you can see from horseback. These 10 games spent that budget on systems, writing, and world building so dense it made the genre look easy. None of them were console hits. Most of them were barely hits at all. All of them are better designed than most of what's been released since. Dark Sun Shattered Lands was released in 1993 by SSI, set in the D&D campaign setting that was, and remains the most distinctive world TSR ever produced. The Dark Sun setting abandons genre defaults deliberately. No gods worth praying to, no metal weapons, a dying desert world where magic drains life from the land, and a social structure built on slavery and gladiatorial combat. They adapted this into an RPG that starts with your party as arena slaves fighting for freedom, and the setting's grimness is functional. It shapes what's available and why every decision carries weight. The combat is turn-based on a grid using the full AD and D 2nd edition rule set, including psionics, which Dark Sun emphasizes over conventional magic. Knights of the Chalice developer Pierre cited Dark Sun as a primary influence on his own combat design. Character creation draws from Dark Sun's unusual races and class restrictions that make those choices meaningful. The lack of metal means weapon economics work differently. The preservation versus defiling magic choice carries real moral and strategic weight. Building a party around the setting's specific constraints feels genuinely different from any other D&D adaptation of the era. The compressed campaign and rough production values stand out even by 1993 standards. The sequel, Wake of the Ravager, expanded the scope. Some encounters are poorly balanced in ways that reflect rushed development. But as a tactical RPG that let its source material actually be dark, where the world's dying condition shapes how the game plays, it stands as one of the best AD&D adaptations made, and one the setting has never received since. Star Trail is the second entry in the Realms of Arcania trilogy, based on Germany's most popular pen-and-paper RPG system, roughly analogous to what D&D is in the English-speaking world. Released in 1994, it won PC Gamer's Best Role-Playing Game of the Year. No RPG had ever contained as much depth or player control. It was well-suited for hardcore role-players. The audience for whom those descriptions are an endorsement rather than a warning is exactly the audience this game was made for. This rule set has a different philosophy from D&D. Every attribute influences multiple systems. A warrior who neglects intelligence struggles with problem solving. A mage who skimps on constitution runs dry before finishing a dungeon. Spells have real casting requirements. The isometric tactical combat, compared by reviewers to Jagged Alliance with a medieval setting, treats positioning and movement economy seriously. A single fight can take 7 or 8 minutes of genuine decision-making. The party survival layer between dungeons, managing food, disease, camp conditions, and injuries, adds pressure that the dungeon design is built around. The flaws are the same ones that define the trilogy. The game can reach unwinnable states through character build mistakes made hours earlier, with no warning before a dungeon that requires abilities you didn't develop. Multiple reviewers noted that a clue book is essentially required. These are not accidental design decisions. They're the genre's contract with the player. Whether that contract is worth signing is a question only you can answer. Knights of the Chalice was built by one person, Pierre Baig, a French developer, and released in 2009 through his website. It implements the D&D 3.5 open game license rule set for a 4-character party across a dungeon crawler campaign loosely drawn from the classic module Scourge of the Slave Lords and Against the Giants. The game has no voice acting, limited animation, and visual design that reviewers noted has a certain functional charm rather than conventional beauty. None of that matters, because the combat engine might have been the best turn-based D&D experience since Dark Sun Shattered Lands. The enemy AI is the achievement. He built AI that functions as a unit. Enemies coordinate, prioritize targets intelligently, combo spells against specific party conditions, and adapt to what you did in the previous turn. RPG Codex's review noted an encounter where the knight was grappled by a giant, the wizard was counterspelled, the cleric was suppressed by archers, and the second knight was charmed. A coordinated tactical shutdown that the AI assembled from the combat state, not a scripted sequence. That level of emergent enemy intelligence was, and largely remains, without peer. The feat's system supports grapple, trip, disarm, 5-foot step repositioning, and dozens of combat maneuvers that most licensed D&D games quietly omit. Big implemented all of it. The crafting system opens in the late game and can tip the balance significantly. To be honest, the story and setting exist as scaffolding for the combat rather than goals in themselves. For a specific kind of player, one who measures an RPG by the intelligence of what it puts against them, Knights of the Chalice is something no publisher with a full studio budget chose to build. Age of Decadence took 11 years to build. Developer Iron Tower Studio, initially just Vince Weller working solo, started development in 2004 and released the final version in 2015. The game built its reputation through years of public development blogs arguing for a specific vision of what a role-playing game should be. Not a combat game with RPG trappings, but a game where character builds genuinely determine which options exist, where narrative choices have real weight, and where the difficulty exists to make those choices matter rather than as an obstacle between you and the content. The setting is a post-collapse Roman-era fantasy world, not standard fantasy Europe, but a world of warring factions, mercenaries, and assassins consolidating power in a civilization's ruins. You choose a background: soldier, merchant, assassin, thief, guildsman, lore master, or drifter, and that choice shapes what the game contains for you. A lore master navigates through knowledge and archaeology, an assassin through contracts and violence. These are not dialogue options delivering the same story with different flavor. They're different games through the same world. 6 competing factions whose relationships shift with your choices feed into endings that reflect the specific accumulation of every major decision. But combat for non-combat builds is brutally unforgiving. The game actively suggests some characters should avoid fights. Some players find this liberating. Others find it genuinely frustrating. But Age of Decadence's central argument, that a role-playing game's depth comes from coherent design rather than content volume, is made so thoroughly it stands as one of the most complete design philosophy statements the PC genre has ever produced. Underrail is a 2015 PC RPG built over 6 years by a 2-person studio in Serbia, Stygian Software, and released independently without a publisher. It draws its lineage directly from the original Fallout games and from Arcanum. Same isometric perspective, same turn-based combat on an action point system, same emphasis on build coherence as a core mechanical skill. The setting is a post-apocalyptic underground civilization built in metro tunnels and caverns beneath a dead Earth, and it commits to that premise with a world-building density that most studios couldn't sustain with 20 times the team. The build system is the game's central challenge and reward. Attributes locked at character creation cascade through the skill tree in ways that aren't always legible to new players. A character built without focus will hit encounters designed around specialized builds. Psi, melee, and sniper builds each require distinct tactical approaches, not just different stat allocations. The combat rewards positioning, stealth, environmental use, and preparation in ways that feel handcrafted even in varied encounters. But there are accessibility barriers. The early game offers almost no guidance, and the gap between a coherent build and an incoherent one is punishing enough that many players bounce off hard in the first few hours. The writing is competent rather than exceptional. Lore is detailed, but characterization of major NPCs rarely reaches the emotional register of the games it most admires. But for players who want the original Fallout design philosophy applied to a world that wasn't built around nostalgia for American pop culture, Underrail is one of the most accomplished RPGs of the last decade.
Another game, perhaps?
Troika Games' final RPG, released in 2003 and the studio's last project before it closed, is the most mechanically faithful adaptation of Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition ever made. Built around the classic 1985 Gary Gygax module, it implements the full D&D 3.0 rule set, later patched to 3.5, with a precision and completeness that no other CRPG before or since is matched. Attacks of opportunity work correctly. Flanking bonuses work correctly. The full feat list is present. The grapple system is implemented. For players who know the tabletop rules, the moment of recognition when the mechanics behave exactly as written is genuinely startling. The combat is turn-based on a visible grid, giving every encounter a tactical legibility that real-time systems obscure. Enemy encounters reflect the original module's design philosophy. Gygax's dungeon existed before you arrived and doesn't bend to accommodate you. 5 different faction paths through the opening give the early game genuine replayability, and the alignment system affects which NPCs will work with you and which paths close off. Troika's recurring problems are still here. The game shipped with severe bugs. The temple itself was largely unplayable at launch. The Circle of 8 community mod pack fixed most critical issues and is now considered essential. The story beyond the module framework is thin. This is a game about the dungeon. Infidelity to the original module means inheriting the design quirks, including encounters that are effectively unwinnable without specific preparation. But for players who wanted D&D implemented correctly, this remains the gold standard that later licensed titles failed to surpass.
Wings of fire in hills shrouded in fog, and fight the...
Arcanum is the second game from Troika Games, the studio founded by 3 of the lead developers of Fallout, and it carries both the ambitions and the instabilities of that lineage. Released in 2000, it builds a Victorian-era fantasy world where industrialization and magic are in active conflict, not as background flavor, but as a systemic tension that runs through every mechanic. High magic characters are disrupted by technology, while high technology characters misfire around magic. NPCs react to your alignment along this axis. The world is built around this conflict in a way that genuinely integrates setting and system. The character creation is Arcanum's greatest achievement and its highest barrier. 18 character backgrounds, 8 colleges of magic with hundreds of spells, and dozens of technical schematics for crafting mechanical devices, with stat systems that interact in ways the game's own tooltips don't fully explain. The skill tree for a gunsmith proceeds differently from that of a persuasive diplomat, an orcish brawler, or a half-elf mage, not just statistically, but experientially. I've played 3 different builds through the same early sections and found mechanically distinct games. The writing matches the ambition. The main story builds real questions about industrialization and what progress costs. But there are some significant limitations. The real-time combat is notoriously poor, widely regarded as one of the weakest systems in the CRPG genre, and the turn-based mode is barely better. The game shipped with bugs that community patches have since addressed. The back half loses narrative density, but as a world, as a system, and as an argument that RPGs can be built around ideas rather than power fantasy, Arcanum remains one of the most fully realized things the PC genre ever produced. Wizardry 8 arrived in 2001 as the conclusion to a trilogy that had begun with Wizardry 6 in 1987, the last entry in a franchise that had defined PC role-playing in the early 80s. Developer Surtech closed before the game could be properly marketed, which meant it launched without publisher support into a market that had moved on to Baldur's Gate and never found the audience it deserved. That commercial failure obscures something remarkable. Wizardry 8 is technically the most accomplished entry in the series and one of the most complete first-person party RPGs ever made. The character system draws from the full Wizardry lineage, 7 base stats, over 15 classes including Bard, Valkyrie, Gadgeteer, and Bishop, and a skill system where proficiency grows from use across hundreds of available skills. The party of up to 6 characters can be built in enough configurations to support multiple distinct playthroughs. The real-time with pause combat uses a spatial positioning system where flanking, elevation, and reach matter in ways that the first-person perspective communicates with unusual clarity. Enemy AI adapts to your tactics in ways that players noted at the time as substantially better than contemporary competition. The quality of life gap between 2001 and now is a barrier. The interface is a product of its era. Inventory management is meticulous to the point of tedium for modern standards, and the early game difficulty spike catches many players before the system reveals its depth. The story continues directly from Wizardry 6 and 7, which is either rewarding continuity for the invested or impenetrable for newcomers. But for the audience willing to engage with it on its own terms, Wizardry 8 is a fully realized endpoint for a design tradition that hasn't been matched since. Betrayal at Krondor arrived in 1993 from developer Dynamics, a company with no RPG experience, known primarily for flight simulators, and produced what Computer Gaming World called a new high watermark in RPG design. It won Computer Gaming World's Role-Playing Game of the Year for 1993, was named Game of the Year by Computer Game Strategy Plus, and was placed on PC Gamer's Best Games Ever list 3 separate times across different years. That's the critical record. The commercial record is the opposite. Initial floppy disk sales were so poor that they sold the rights back before the CD-ROM release turned it into a hit. The game is structured like a novel, 9 named chapters, third-person narration, a bookmark save system, and written with the confidence of someone who understood that an RPG could feel like reading a good book without sacrificing depth. The chapter structure is largely open. You're given a direction but rarely stop from going elsewhere first. Skill growth is use-based rather than level-based. Swing swords to improve swordsmanship, cast spells to improve spellcasting. Mordhell wordlock chests scattered across the world require solving riddles to open, a puzzle mechanic reviewers singled out consistently as one of the most satisfying elements. But the pacing can be off. The first-person overworld movement is slow, and some critics found the maintenance activities, armor repair, inventory management, tedious without compensating depth. The follow-up, Return to Krondor, was considerably weaker. But Betrayal at Krondor itself is one of those games that understood what it was trying to do so clearly that it accomplished something most developers with 10 times the resources couldn't replicate. Darklands is a 1992 microprose RPG set in a mythologized 15th century Holy Roman Empire. Not Tolkien's fantasy Europe, not D&D Sword and Sorcery Europe, but the actual historical Germany of that era, where kobolds and dragons coexist with real geography, real saints whose intercession you can invoke in combat, and real alchemical traditions that work as a functional magic system. Rock Paper Shotgun called it one of the best RPGs ever made in a 2014 retrospective. GameSpot included it on its list of the greatest games of all time. It required a decade of aging to reach that consensus, and the reasons it took so long are worth understanding. The game shipped in 1992 broken enough that it was literally impossible to complete in its original state. Patches followed, but in a pre-internet era, they circulated on BBS systems and through informal copying. Many people only ever played the version that crashed under its own weight. What the bugs concealed was something genuinely original. Classless, skill-based character development where 4 character parties aged in real time. An open world where your reputation varied region by region. Over-the-shoulder, real-time with pause combat that predated Baldur's Gate by 6 years, and alchemy, saintly prayer, and street fighting as equally valid approaches to the same encounters. Beyond the bugs, there's repetition. Encounters are procedurally generated, meaning extended play can feel like variations on the same handful of scenarios. The writing is dense with historical detail, but lacks the atmosphere that detail should produce. These are real limitations. But no game before or since has built an RPG around the actual popular beliefs of medieval Germany. The specific saints, monsters, and texture of a world that took itself entirely on its own terms.